Welcome everyone who is here. I'm Brian Young. I'm the president-elect of the League of Utah Writers, and I'm really excited that everyone's here today. For those of you who are here, I'm assuming you know that the League was able to secure a grant to do an anthology. And as part of that grant, the anthology is going to be called Beyond Beehives. And it's an anthology really designed to celebrate stories from during Utah's 125 years of statehood. This was a grant from the state's Cultural and Community Engagement Department, and we will be paying the contributors who end up making it into the anthology. And we've been able to pay for some extra other bonus material. And one of those things that we put in the grant application was having Quinn Rollins here, who's a really terrific history teacher in the Granite School District, come and just kind of give us a primer on like sort of Utah history, and then take us through some of those areas of maybe lesser known Utah history. And the idea is that not that you need to write about any of these topics specifically, but that maybe something Quinn teaches us here in this hour is going to be able to send you down a rabbit hole that might inspire you into something that you might write a story about. Or maybe it shows you everything you want to avoid as far as writing a story about. Who knows? But I think this is a really great opportunity for us to learn about some of this stuff and, really make this anthology shine. And this is for open to writers across the state or anyone with a connection to Utah. So you don't have to be a member of the League of Utah Writers. You don't have to be even a resident of the state necessarily. We just want the best work that sort of ties into Utah during its time of statehood and some of those unknown stories. So if you want the submission link, you can go to the League of Utah Writers website and click on calls for submission, and then click Beyond Beehives. And when you get your story ready, you can submit it there, and you'll be able to find a recording of this presentation there. As soon as this is over, I'll get this uploaded to YouTube, and Quinn, you'll be on display for that. But so thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I'm really excited to see what you come up with. And I hope I see everybody here at the League birthday party, which is going to be July 31st. We're going to have some hors d'oeuvres there and a silent auction. And I hope I see everybody at the Quills conference, and we get to celebrate, our acceptances into this anthology. So without further ado, take it away, Quinn. Again, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here tonight. So I am a history teacher. That's my go-to self-description of myself is, I have become a history teacher. My dad was a professor of Utah history. I fought against following in his footsteps for as long as I could, and then started teaching about 17 years ago. I taught at Benyon Junior High in Taylorsville for 8 years. And the reason I bring that up is that it was teaching Utah history to 7th graders. And when I got hired to teach Utah history, even though I had grown up in Utah, I didn't ever remember that I had a Utah history class. Once I got hired, I was like, that's what they were doing in 7th grade. That's what that textbook was, because it was framed very much as a Mormon pioneer history class, and that's basically what it was. And I think that that knowing state history, knowing local history, is something that's often an oversight in the history community. So often we look at, and I will be watching the chat, so Brian just put that in there. But if you have a question, chat is good. There will be time for Q&A at the end of this. So looking forward to answering questions. that I probably won't know the answer to, but I can make something up or give you my best guess. Um, I think that if for knowing Utah's history, I think there is so much overlap with Mormon history and cultural history, and I think all that's very interesting. But I think there are a lot of stories that don't get told as often, and so we're going to try to get into some of those today. After Benyon Junior High, I was in the school district office helping write curriculum for other history teachers in Granite School District. And then for the last 3 years, I've been teaching US history at Cypress High School in Magna. And I'm also an instructor at the University of Utah teaching future history teachers how to be history teachers. I think they pay me to go there and do things, and I think that's what I do there. Um, Now it'll take me just a second to get my right screen going. You would think after a year of using Zoom, I would be much better at this. All right, do we have something that says Utah History Overview
Yes.
on there? All right, thank you. All right, so if you have questions afterwards, if you ever want to reach out, that's my email address. I will be giving this this presentation to Brian to post elsewhere. Probably the easiest way to get me is through social media. My Twitter and Instagram are both at Jedi Hermit, because that's the kind of nerd I am. But this is a safe space. So the traditional Utah history narrative is basically that Native Americans were a thing for a while. And then the Mormons discover Utah, Transcontinental Railroad comes through, Utah becomes a state. And from that point on, it just becomes a conservative part of the United States, and US history is the same thing as Utah history, but it's not, it isn't quite that simple. It's more complicated, more complex, and less white bread than sometimes we make it sound. Now, the emphasis of the writing project is on from statehood on, so from 1896 on. There are a lot of the stories before that that inform what happens after, though. So in my classes, I try to have an emphasis on connections to the students, connections to you. So for us tonight, my big questions would be, why are you in Utah instead of some other part of the world? What story can you tell because Utah has had an influence on you? And then what does Utah bring to the story that you're telling? So whether it's a poem or a story or a creative nonfiction, is that what it was? Why is it that Utah can tell that story? Because we're here. So part of it is the geography, part of it's the history, which is our focus tonight, the culture, the politics, the religion. I have hosted conferences about Utah history that have had teachers come from across the country. And one of the things that we see, it's a week-long workshop. About 2 days into the workshop, these teachers from back east usually will kind of sidle up to you and kind of whisper like, so are you Mormon? Like how many wives do you have? And so they'll ask these questions as because they see Utah as a unique place. And some of that uniqueness, I think, is interesting and positive and good. And then some of it uh, kind of slides into the not so good. But they're stories we can tell because we're here in Utah. So in uh, the prospect for the league, the pitch for your stories says, tell us a story about Utah and its statehood. Tell us a story about what it's like being here. Tell us about Utah's history or future. Tell us hidden and unknown stories of folks forgotten in the history books. So going way back, I think it does us a disservice to overlook the distant past, to overlook what happened to the native peoples who were here long before us and for a much longer time than we've been here. So going way back, you have the Fremont culture and the ancestral Puebloan. Ancestral Puebloan is what we used to call Anasazi. Over the last 10 or 15 years, they've sort of transitioned from using the word Anasazi to using the term ancestral Puebloan. And that's a thing between the Hopi and the Navajo. So preferred term right now is ancestral Puebloan. The Fremont culture covered most of the state of Utah. That map on the right, though, there was sort of an overlap between the ancestral Puebloans and the Fremont. And my only real message here is that there were distinct and complex cultures that were here for 1,000 years before even the traditional Native American cultures were there. Fremont culture in particular, the Salt Lake Valley was home to thousands of people, often in pit houses, villages. There's a tracks station downtown. It's right by the Vivint Arena that has that arrowhead monument as part of it. And that's where there was a Fremont village that they unearthed in 1999 when they were putting in tracks. Actually, several places as they were putting in tracks, they kept on coming across these Fremont villages that then they had to stop and excavate. And each one of them was the center of dozens of families that had been in a village there. There, it was right along what we call City Creek today, but pretty much anywhere there where there's a water source in Utah, that's where history, in this case prehistory, happened. Most of the rock art that Utah is famous for came from the Fremont. They had extensive trade networks, and so you would find shells and beads and stones from as far away as the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico. So there were extensive trade networks that were here before Europeans got here. Usually in a Utah history class, we talk about the 5 historic tribes, and that'd be the Ute, the Paiute, the Goshute, the Shoshone, and the Navajo. The Ute, the Paiute, and the Goshute are all related. They're all part of the same language family, same culture, same genetic history. The Ute is really primarily a Colorado group, but comes over into Utah, of course. The Goshute is one of the Great Basin tribes that is small in number, but very had a very, they were survivors, basically. And the way they would do that is by traveling from place to place, being up in the mountains in the summers when it's brutally hot, coming down to the flatlands and hot springs in the winters, never really building up in big numbers, but able to survive nonetheless. The Navajo at the time was one of the strongest nations. It is today the largest Native American nation in terms of numbers. There was a lot of conflict between the Navajo and the Ute in particular, but also between the Navajo and Anglo-Americans, the people in Spanish America, and that formed a sort of barrier between what was happening in Mexico, Spanish colonies there, and what was happening in Utah. So the reason we don't have we didn't have Spanish missions up in Utah is mostly because of the Navajo. They were fierce enough, they sort of formed a shield or a barrier between Mexico and Utah. So we didn't end up with the Spanish settlements that you got in New Mexico, Arizona, California, Texas, because of the Navajo, basically. Some early interactions between the European Americans and Native Americans include Father Dominguez and Escalante. That mural is on the inside of the dome of the state capitol. In 1776, they were going from Santa Fe, New Mexico to Monterey, California, and they were trying to find a nice route that would avoid the Navajo and the Grand Canyon. They ended up as far north as Utah Valley. They saw Utah Lake. They did not make it as far north as the Salt Lake Valley. But their interactions and the interactions of the mountain men and the fur trappers that followed them were largely peaceful with the Native Americans. The Utah Valley was one of the headquarters isn't the right word, a stronghold for the Ute Indians. And so they, it's kind of funny that the Utes were down in Provo, but that's, totally different thing. So Utah Lake and Utah Valley was a really, it was a stronghold for them, mostly because of the lake and the fish. It was a very abundant place for them to be. Later, as mountain men and fur trappers came in, they interacted more with the Native Americans, using them as guides, as resources, often marrying and intermarrying with Native Americans. Government explorers that came in later, like John C. Fremont, John Wesley Powell, were basically passing through. They weren't coming to stay. And that's the case with most of these early groups. The reason we don't talk about them as much is because they didn't stay. There are some mountain men like Jim Bridger who established Fort Bridger in Wyoming. There's Miles Goodyear that established Fort Buenaventura up in Ogden. But for the most part, they were temporary here. Sorry about that. In 1846, another famous group to come through was the Donner Party, or the Donner Reed Party. Donner Reed, not Donna Reed. That's a totally different party. I won't go there. Okay, so the Donner Reed Party, of course, they were an expedition. They were on their way to California. They were told about a shortcut that would take them through Utah instead of through southern Idaho. It was called the Hastings Cutoff. And it was published by a guy who had never been here, never taken this path, but they were suckered into believing this shortcut would work for them. So they came down Emigration Canyon. So Emigration Canyon, that's the canyon. The mouth of it is where Hogle Zoo is. It's where Ruth's Diner is. It was filled with scrub oak. So it took the Donner Party about 4 weeks to cut their way from the top of Emigration Canyon down to the Salt Lake Valley, uh, which was brutal. It cost them a month. That probably is what doomed them in the Sierra Nevadas. Um, but it also, this same path took them across the salt flats. Uh, and if you can imagine crossing the salt flats in summer with oxen and wagons and children, a lot. They lost a lot of animals. They lost a lot of their wagons. They describe it as a quagmire, basically, of salt and mud, which is what it is. Um, and so that is pretty much what doomed the Donner Reed Party. This Emigration Canyon is the same path that the Mormons would take the following year. Instead of taking them 4 weeks to get down Emigration Canyon, it took them about 4 days. So they have the Donner Party to thank for making that a little bit easier for them. Once the Mormons get to Utah, starting in 1847, we usually think about their interactions with Native Americans as being relatively peaceful. And I think the stories of Mormons and Native Americans, I think there's some interesting ones to be told there. When they get to the Salt Lake Valley, they don't have immediate competition with Native Americans because the Salt Lake Valley was kind of a neutral zone between the Utes and the Shoshone. The Shoshone came down about to the Great Salt Lake. The Ute territory stopped at Utah Lake. The Salt Lake Valley was basically, they would come and go, they would trade with each other there, but there weren't many Native Americans settled here as a permanent settlement. So the Mormons get here, and because they start at the Salt Lake Valley, they don't have immediate competition with Native Americans. But as they spread out up and down the Wasatch Front and then into central and southern Utah, there's more and more friction with Native Americans. So most Mormon communities, they have a center where you have the residents, the homes are inside the interior of a town, and then the farms are all around the outside, so that basically if you need to, you can call everybody back into, you can contract, you can fort up when the Native Americans are seen as a threat. Or later, the US Army, but we'll get to that in just a minute. There are a few significant conflicts. One is the Walker War, Chief Wakara. There's a conflict between Brigham Young and his family with Wakara and his family. Lasts about 2 years, settled relatively peacefully. The Black Hawk War, or Utah's Black Hawk War, because there's another Black Hawk War, lasts about 7 years, from about 1865 to 1872. And it's very widespread and it's very bloody. There are individual events within it, like the Circleville Massacre, where they kill 24 men, women, and children. To be clear, it's 24 Native American people that are killed. But there are hundreds of skirmishes across that 7-year period. At the end of that 7 years, the Ute population has gone from about 23,000 to about 10,000. Not all of those people were killed. Most of them just moved to other parts. Most of them moved over into Colorado. But what it does is it opens up central Utah, especially for settlement of Mormon farmers. And so that was the process that moved Native Americans onto reservation. There was a big movement among the Mormons to convert Native Americans, to adopt Native American children if they were orphaned. Um, in that way, Utah has a more peaceful history with Native Americans than some other Western states do, but not always. So looking at some of the Mormon stories that get told and untold and mistold, I think there's some very interesting things in the pioneer period about the kind of breaking and the rebuilding of the LDS Church, the period after Nauvoo and before the 20th century. The Mormon Church does a lot of, they make a lot of changes. They do a lot of things to make people more committed to their practices than maybe they would have been if they hadn't moved to Utah. When they move to Utah, they're doing it, that they're leaving the United States and going to Mexico. Utah doesn't become a part of the United States until after 1847. That's when it becomes a territory, and then doesn't become a state until 1896. So it has about a 50-year period where it's a territory, not a state. There are some sort of miracles and myths, foundational myths that I think are interesting, like the miracle of the gulls. There's a great article that weighs the nutritional value of crickets versus wheat, and basically makes the argument that if the Mormons hadn't prayed for the seagulls to come save their crops, they would have been better off just eating the crickets. But, you know, crickets are gross, so makes a better story. The handcart myths, I know growing up, I saw handcart statues and handcart paintings and handcart everything. And handcarts were only used by about 5% of the Mormons that made that trek in the pioneer period. Because basically it was the worst possible way to go. You wouldn't want to do it. And so that makes it more of a sacrifice. But also some of these stories, I think, get overblown and overtold. I didn't think I put Jeanbaptiste on that slide, but I did. And he was a grave robber who, in the 1870s, I think, he was sort of an itinerant laborer, and he got busted for grave robbing in the Salt Lake City cemetery. When they arrested him, they found 300 different items of clothing, suggesting he had been doing this for a long time. He had mobs of people that wanted to string him up, and he got banished to an island in the Great Salt Lake. It was originally Antelope Island. Then he got moved out to Fremont Island. And within a year, he disappeared. And they think he built a raft and escaped from Fremont Island. And then there are these stories about finding a body with a ball and chain on it and like ghosts and stuff. I like ghosts, but I don't think that is quite what happened. There are also a lot of Mormon stories that don't get told. I think Black Mormons, I think the female experience isn't told as much. Just in the last couple of weeks, they had a display for Pride Month that had all of these Mormon pioneer LGBTQ individuals. So Charles Edmonds and Luke Carter, who were in one of the handcart companies, and there's some evidence that they were a couple. They were both widowers who came together and stayed together. Brigham M. Young, who was one of Brigham Young's sons, who was also sort of a drag queen, dressed up as Madame Paterini, and had a pretty good career doing that. There's William/Ava McCleary. William McCleary was married and had 5 children. After the 5 children were out of the house, his wife divorced him, and William became Ava McCleary and lived as a woman for the rest of his life. And I think those are stories that don't get told. Evan Stevens wrote a lot of the Mormon hymns and was a confirmed bachelor, that had lots of male friends. And it's just an interesting part of Utah history, Utah stories that doesn't get told very often. The Utah War, something that you don't hear much about, conflict between the US government and Mormons. Basically, the Mormons had been very happy with their own territorial governor, Brigham Young. And as they continued to do the polygamy thing, the US government got less and less patient with them, eventually sent out the US Army with a new governor to replace Brigham Young. This is at the same time as the Mormons were going through their own reformation, where Mormons were getting rebaptized to sort of reconfirm their commitment to the faith. And it just escalates the tension between the Mormons and the United States government. It leads to things like the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which has the Mormons in such a heightened state, basically, that they would kill people who otherwise may not have been a threat to them, results in a permanent military presence in Utah, indirectly leads to things like the Bear River Massacre, which is the killing of hundreds of Shoshone just across the border in Preston, Idaho, by the US Army. So never a direct war, but a very leads to a series of bloody conflicts. Some other stories that I really like, Yosepa was a colony of Hawaiian Mormon converts in the Skull Valley. So that's just 2 valleys over from me, just west of Tooele, where they had joined the Mormon Church. And at the time, the expectation was if you join the Mormon Church, you come to Utah. And so you have hundreds of Hawaiians that are in the middle of some of the worst desert in the Great Basin, that are there because of their faith. And it's interesting, the pieces of their culture they try to bring with them, they try to reproduce, and eventually most of them go back to Hawaii. There are other pioneer experiences like the Panguitch Quilt Walk, where basically to ensure the survival of their town, these men take these quilts and lay them as a path to walk from Panguitch to Parowan, about 30 miles in the snow, to get food and supplies to take back with them to Panguitch. There are a lot of intersections with the national story in Utah. The Pony Express came right through here. That's a monument on Main Street in Salt Lake City. Transcontinental Railroad comes through Ogden. Polygamy, it was basically the stumbling block to Utah becoming a state. So Utah was the territory that was a territory longest before becoming a state. About 20% of pioneer Mormon households were polygamist. Divorce was permitted. Divorce was common. Part of the reason is that Brigham Young and other Mormon leaders were very sensitive to and hyper aware of the stories that were being told about it. So they kind of wanted to make clear that if women wanted to not be a part of this, they didn't need to be. And so that was another one of the myths that they were trying to tackle there. So some places, if you're looking for diverse stories, Sometimes I think Utah has this reputation of being very white, very white and white bread. But historically, and this is really from, this is a lot of 20th century stuff. Um, but starting with the railroad's completion in 1869, and for the next, up through the 1930s, there was a really substantial Chinatown in Ogden. Ogden has a lot of great stories there. Um, Chinatown in particular, 25th Street, which has sort of seen a revival in the last decade or so, was kind of notorious for having gambling dens and saloons, and there are these tunnels that go underneath Ogden. Most cities of a certain age have those tunnels for coal delivery, but if you already have illegal stuff happening at ground level and you have tunnels to do other even more illegal stuff in, that's what people are going to do. So Chinatown in Ogden was notorious for having those. Japantown, which was right around the Salt Palace in Salt Lake City, started out with a group of about 30 families and grew. There's still Japanese Christian church right there behind the Salt Palace Convention Center, and another Japanese temple. Sage Market on Main Street and about 13th South is another one of those pieces, kind of artifacts that's still around from Japantown. Big Greek and Italian community in Price. Some of that ended up in Salt Lake City. Lagoon was in the rest of the United States, or in much of the United States, Lagoon would have been a segregated place. It was really known more for swimming and for dancing than it was for like amusement park rides. But the owner of Lagoon, the Freed family, they were adamant that black and white kids could be dancing on the same dance floor. They could be swimming in the same swimming pool. Even when they were confronted about it by people that wanted that segregation, they managed to keep Lagoon desegregated. There's a lot out there about Japanese American internment. There have been some great graphic novels recently, not set in the Topaz camp, but just a more general Japanese American internment story. Salt Lake City had a pretty notorious red light district. If you know where Regent Street is, just south of City Creek Mall and north of Gallivan Center, that was where the red light district was. It was getting to be a little too popular with the sketchy people of the city, but also the respected people of the city. And so the city fathers ended up building something they called the stockade. And the stockades were behind the Greek Orthodox Church over on 300 West. And it was basically rows of one-room apartments, basically, that were there to get the prostitution problem away from the center of downtown and over onto the side. And those buildings are still there behind the Greek Orthodox Church. There's still this 2 rows of just tiny apartments that are just right there. The Murray smelters. One of the things about the Salt Lake Valley is you have all these smaller towns, smaller communities that come together to just be one big Salt Lake County now. But the smelters area, they had, I think it was 40 different saloons and bars. So it was kind of a hot spot for people to be there. And a lot of the places that are associated with mining, with smelting, Magna is another one. It was called Ragtown. It was built basically in the mine tailings of the Kennecott, the Bingham mines. but a lot of them have a really rich history that goes well into the 1930s, 1940s. Bingham, Alta, Park City. Corinne was making a big run for being an anti-Salt Lake City. It's mostly 19th century, but that's just, it's up by Ogden. Basically, after the railroad was completed, they wanted to kind of give the middle finger to Salt Lake City, and kind of did it pretty well for a few decades. There are some great single story kind of people that I think are fascinating. In the pioneer period, you have people like Porter Rockwell, who was, you could call him an assassin or a bounty hunter or a spiritual. Anyway, he has a lot going on for him. Kind of Brigham Young's right-hand man in a lot of ways. Butch Cassidy is from Utah. He's from Circleville and was active in the Robbers Roost area down in south central Utah. John Wesley Powell, one-armed Civil War veteran who came out here and was the first one to use scientific instruments to study the Green River and the Colorado River. So he was in a lot of southeastern Utah and did it all with like one arm. So good for him. Some you may not have heard of, Marie Ogden in the 1920s, that there was a big movement towards spiritualism. So this is when you have like Edgar Cayce, you have people believing in seances and believing in spirit writing, things like that. Well, Marie Ogden was doing some spirit writing, and it was revealed that she was supposed to come to Utah, just north of Monticello, south of Moab, and build a utopia. At its peak, it had about 100 households there. She had been sort of riding the coattails of someone else, but that someone else kind of turned into a Nazi, and so she got off of those coattails, which is a good move. But had a lot of prophecies about the end of the world that didn't come to pass. So her fame kind of faded over the years, but very interesting kind of tiny piece of history. Chief Posey was a Paiute leader who was kind of fighting against the US government up until about 1914, 1915, and was doing this in southeastern Utah, there in the desert, and was basically saying, you're never going to take me, and kept on fighting up until the end. Basically brought the plight of what was happening to Native Americans on reservations to a wider audience. There's the Volga vixen, Anna Rich Marks, who was, she owned mines. She's sort of Utah's unsinkable Molly Brown. Probably killed a lot of people, or the stories are she killed a lot of people who were trying to take her mines away. Joe Hill was killed in the Sugar House prison, became a sort of a union, he was a union leader, kind of became a martyr to that cause. Everett Roos is he was a teenage boy. He was an artist, he was a poet, kind of believed in wandering around, trying to find himself, and eventually lost himself. And people really don't know exactly what became of him, but he's a very interesting person to follow up on. Oh, I forgot this is going to be on YouTube. I can't say weird shit, but there it is. So one of the things I love about Utah, and I love about the West in general, is just there is a lot of weird things that happen here that don't happen in cities. They don't happen to everybody. And I think things like the monolith that appeared in 2020, which we know now was just an art installation, but it could have been UFOs because it's Utah. You don't know. We have things like the Devil's Highway, and we have Bigfoot, and we have monsters and aliens. It's like you don't have all that stuff everywhere. Utah has it. Some quick pages of resources, then we have a few minutes for questions and answers. The Utah State Historical Society has all of these great publications that are entirely free. So that link that ends in stacks will take you to their list of publications. The one I recommend the most is Beehive History, and that's really, it's meant for kids, for classrooms, but issue number 25 is all about Utah families, and it has like 20 different stories about 20 different people from different parts of the world and why they came here. So they have like Jewish families that settled here. They have Russian families that escaped pogroms and settled in Box Elder County. They have just all these stories of people that came here for different reasons. The Native American Digital Archive is a great resource. In the last year, there was an organization called Better Days 2020 that was doing a lot with women's history in Utah, and they have some really great resources there. Latinos in Utah, Hispanic Heritage, LGBTQ Utah, and then all these book recommendations, some anthologies, survey history, so just kind of all of Utah history, Native American specific, Mormon specific, women, and paranormal, because I like weird things that are not probably real, but I'm gonna believe in them anyway, because that's how I do. Alexis, going back to the graphic novels, there's one by George Takei. It was called When We Were the Enemy, I believe. Yeah, and then the other one I can find in just a minute. And Brian, that playlist of videos, is that the Salt Lake City Minute?
Yes.
Okay.
There's almost 200 of them now.
Yeah, I was going to recommend those as well. That's probably the best YouTube resource is the videos that Brian works on.
And I would say if anybody has questions about those videos specifically, I did all the research and wrote all of them. So I'm available for that.
And Alexis, the other book about Japanese American internment is called Displacement, which I love because it kind of departs from history, and you have this girl going back and forth in time to her grandmother's experience in an internment camp to her own life. So it's very much like Octavia Butler's Kindred, if you've read that, but it's like graphic novel and Japanese American. Any questions about all of this, or stuff I left out, or stuff I should have done better, or all of the above?
I'm curious, Quinn, as you have gone through history, like what's your favorite rabbit hole you've fallen down doing this sort of research?
Honestly, up until this last year, it was it was the Spanish flu in Utah. Honestly, uh, the just the experience, Utah experiencing something the whole country was experiencing, but through a Utah lens. Um, I think is always interesting. So the Spanish flu was really devastating in Utah, partially because of our climate and partially uh, just the way our towns are laid out. Um, if you go back and look at how they canceled school and they canceled church, they canceled things, they had anti-mask rallies. I, I I was teaching seventh graders about all of these things like 10 years ago, never thinking it would be relevant to all of us today, but that was something.
There are 6 or 7 videos in that playlist about the 1918 flu pandemic. It
Hmm.
covers all of that stuff. That's really fun.
The other thing I think is interesting about Utah is we have this tension between wanting to be unique, wanting to be out from under the yoke of the federal government, to very much wanting to fit in. And so I think with things around that same time, things like Utahns signing up in droves for World War One, things like us deciding to execute Joe Hill, even though so many people were asking us not to. So much of that is our desperation to fit in and be like the other states. When we were established, uh, pushing back on that, like not wanting to be a state, not wanting to be our territory of Deseret, wanting to be our own kingdom, you know? Um, so I think that transition is always an interesting one. Uh, Terra, that that Sphinx has Joseph Smith's face, and it's at a place called Gilgal Garden, which is kind of across Seventh East from Trolley Square. And it's this guy who was a mason and kind of amateur sculptor, and he kind of put his religious beliefs into some really weird kind of devotional art, which some of it I think is beautiful, and some of it is weird, and some of it I don't understand. So I think that's what art does. And Nancy, I always think things like interstates and freeways and what they do and they don't do. I always think things like that are interesting. Honestly, I mean things like Interstate 15 following the same route as the old Spanish Trail for a big part of it. You know, paralleling the trains, the Pony Express routes. It's like I think all of those things, especially where Utah calls itself the crossroads of the West so often. It's like there's a reason that we say things like that. It's if we didn't have those connections to every place else, it would be kind of lonely out here.
Do you mind if I add, Quinn, one thing on the internment camp? You can find in the archives the daily newspaper that they used to print at the camp, the Topaz Times, and that's got all kinds of really interesting stuff as far as that goes. Sorry, I don't mean to intrude. I'm just really nerdy about this stuff too.
You are not intruding at all. The I think the one of the most interesting things about the internment camp to me is how mundane it all kind of seemed. Like that they were trying to make it as much like everyday life, but within barbed wire, as they could. There's a very good book out there. It's it's basically it's kind of a scrapbook, an elementary school scrapbook of Topaz, and they kept a diary, and it's kind of artifacts from an elementary school at the Topaz internment camp. That I think it's just interesting to see kind of their everyday slice of life. If you go to Delta, Utah now, just a few years ago, they opened a new internment camp museum. For decades, there really wasn't much there to see. And there's a beautiful museum there now that does a great job of interpreting things. It has a good bookstore. Um, it's well worth the trip. And Susan, excommunications are always fun. I don't care who you are. There's always a good story behind them.
If no one else has any other questions, I would just thank you, Quinn, and do you want to put up that slide of where people can contact you if they want to ask you more questions again?
Yes.
And then we'll post this. We'll post this on the website for that. Anna, your question about how much research is required for these stories. Fiction is fiction. So, as much research as you want to do to be inspired to tell a story. So, I won't make it any secret that one of the topic I think I might go for my story that I'm going to submit to this, Quinn touched on a little bit, and that was the stockades in Salt Lake City. And that's been a deep rabbit hole for me for a long time. I'd thought about doing stuff at Topaz too. That was an even deeper rabbit hole. I researched that I've been researching Topaz and just collecting research on it for literally 20 years. So I don't expect anybody to do that much research, but just whatever you need for the inspiration, because it can be fiction, it can be historical fiction, it can be contemporary too, and it can have themes that tie into these things. So the anthology is just really open. It's like any stories that tell a story about Utah during the statehood or leading to the statehood, whether that's contemporary and something that speaks to what our statehood means now, something that speaks to what what it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 125 years ago, how we got on that path, what it was like as a territory. For the creative nonfiction, you might need more research, but that's something else. So if you've got anything, any last words or a sign off, Quinn, I just want to thank you again for doing this. This was terrific, and I learned stuff. There's rabbit holes I'm going to go down after this now, actually.
Well, thank you. I love sharing Utah history and Utah stories. Those books towards the end, I think any one of those really opens up a lot of possibilities. And really, I don't know, we're all here for a reason, I think there are stories here just waiting to be told.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Quinn, so much for doing this. The recording will be up soon, and I will stop that.